He was the foremost expert in unmasking deception hidden within ancient objects. Whenever a priceless relic arrived with questionable origins, museums and collectors turned to him, knowing he would deliver the unflinching truth without hesitation. Yet on this particular occasion, the truth arrived uninvited, wrapped in the quiet gaze of a wooden Virgin Mary that had waited more than 2 centuries in silence. A fragrance of roses suddenly filled an empty room where no flowers grew. A man whose breath had been steadily stolen by illness began, inexplicably, to breathe freely once more. What unfolded next would quietly dismantle the walls of certainty he had built around his life, revealing something far greater than any artifact he had ever examined. Before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary have reached. And if you haven't yet joined our family, subscribe now, because here, each day, we witness the tender love and mighty power of the Mother of God. There exists a certain kind of person who has witnessed so much of the world's hidden flaws that belief in anything beyond the tangible seems almost childish to them. Not out of pride, but out of sheer weariness, as though too many years spent peeling back layers of forgery have left little room for wonder. That person was Frank Y. At 48 years old, he had become one of the most trusted authenticators of historical artifacts across the country. Major museums sought his opinion before investing in acquisitions that could cost millions. Private collectors paid substantial fees simply to receive one of his meticulously documented reports. Auction houses kept his contact information at the very top of their lists, sometimes waiting months for the privilege of having his signature declare a piece genuine. Frank possessed an almost uncanny ability to distinguish authentic antiquity from clever imitation. He could examine a fragment of wood and immediately recognize whether it had aged naturally over centuries or been artificially distressed using modern chemicals and controlled heat. He understood the minute patterns of wear that only genuine time could etch into a surface, the subtle microcracks that form slowly and honestly, and the tiny betrayals that expose even the most skillful forgeries. And Frank was, without question, an atheist. For him, existence consisted entirely of what could be measured, weighed, tested, and proven. Miracles, divine intervention, the very notion of a soul. These were comforting illusions people invented to soften the harsh edges of reality. Frank had long since outgrown such stories, yet his work was never primarily about money. He pursued it because he was exceptionally good at it, because decades of study had made him one of the very best, and also because, quietly, it had become the only part of his life that still felt certain. Everything else had slipped away while he was occupied elsewhere. His marriage had dissolved 2 years earlier. Diane left on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon. There had been no explosive argument, no raised voices echoing through the house. She simply packed her belongings in calm silence while Frank remained in his study, red pen moving across a detailed authentication report. When she appeared in the doorway with the final suitcase, she paused. "You're not even going to ask why I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady but heavy with exhaustion. Frank lifted his eyes briefly from the page. He said nothing. "That silence," she continued, "that constant distance. For years I've lived in competition with objects that have been dead for centuries. Goblets that once belonged to forgotten kings, fragile vases, cracked statues. I grew tired of always losing to things that cannot love me back." He did not protest. He did not ask her to reconsider. He merely nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and returned his attention to the document in front of him. There was also their son, Brian, now 23, living in a different city. Nearly a full year had passed since their last real conversation. Frank repeatedly told himself this was simply how life worked. Children grow up, build their own paths, drift naturally into independence. Deep inside, however, he understood the truth. He had chosen, again and again, the next examination, the next urgent deadline, the next transatlantic flight over everything else. The pattern had formed so gradually that he barely noticed it happening. One missed birthday, one postponed visit, one promise of later that never arrived. Time, he had learned too late, does not wait for later. Frank was also the sort of man who refused help from anyone. It always felt simpler to manage alone, to insist that everything remained under control, to maintain the appearance that no one was needed. Perhaps that was why he kept secret what was slowly happening inside his own body. The cough had begun 3 years earlier, at first nothing more than a mild irritation he attributed to dust from ancient storage vaults or mold lingering in the basements of old institutions. Gradually it deepened. Shortness of breath appeared. A persistent exhaustion settled into his bones, one no amount of rest could dispel. Climbing even 2 flights of stairs left him leaning against the wall, one hand pressed to his chest, waiting for air that arrived reluctantly. During an important evaluation in front of 3 museum officials, he had been forced to sit down suddenly in the middle of the room, struggling to breathe while the others watched in awkward concern. The silence that followed was far more painful than the lack of oxygen itself. After that incident, he finally visited a specialist. The diagnosis was grim: a progressive degenerative condition of the lungs. The doctor spoke carefully of treatment options that might slow the decline, of maintaining quality of life, of setting realistic expectations. Frank listened with the same detached expression he wore when examining a suspected fake, cool, analytical, as though the prognosis concerned someone else entirely. "Do you understand what I've just told you?" the doctor asked. "I understand," Frank replied. "What do you intend to do?" "Continue working," he answered simply, "for as long as I'm able." The doctor studied him for a long moment, then let out a quiet sigh. "This condition doesn't improve, Frank. At best it stabilizes. You may have years ahead, or perhaps only months. Much depends on how carefully you care for yourself from now on." Frank offered no further response. He shared the news with no one, not Diane, who still telephoned occasionally to ask how he was, not his colleagues, who had begun to notice his slower pace and increasing pallor. He carried the knowledge alone, as he carried nearly everything else. Then, on an October Thursday when the cough had been especially relentless and sleep had eluded him for several nights, the telephone rang. Frank stood motionless for several long moments after the fragrance of roses had faded, the empty room once more smelling only of dust, aged wood, and the faint mustiness of a house long closed to fresh air. He shook his head slowly, almost as if trying to dislodge the memory of that impossible scent from his mind. "You're losing it, Frank," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible even in the quiet. With deliberate movements, he returned to the small table, picked up his notebook again, and forced himself to continue the examination. His handwriting, usually so precise, wavered just slightly on the next few lines. Later that afternoon, he descended the creaking staircase to find Catherine waiting in the dimly lit parlor. She looked up expectantly as he entered. "The statue appears authentic," Frank told her, his voice steady once more. "The wood shows consistent natural aging. The craftsmanship aligns with techniques used in sacred art from the 18th century, likely European, possibly Italian or Spanish. But to be certain, to determine its precise origin and full value, I need to conduct more detailed tests in my laboratory back in Ohio. I have specialized microscopes, access to comparative databases, and colleagues who can assist with provenance research." Catherine listened attentively, her tired eyes brightening a little at the news. "How long would that take?" "A few weeks, perhaps a month at most. I would handle the piece with the utmost care, full insurance coverage, complete documentation, secure transport. You would have nothing to worry about." "And its value?" she asked quietly. "Do you have any initial sense?" Frank hesitated. He was not in the habit of offering premature estimates, but something about the statue, the quiet dignity of its presence, made him speak more openly than usual. It's still too early to be certain, but if my preliminary impressions hold, it could be worth far more than most people would expect for a piece of devotional art from that period. Enough to make a real difference for your family. Catherine nodded slowly, then offered a small, grateful smile. All right, you may take it. I trust you, Dr. Y. Frank thanked her. As he prepared to leave, Catherine glanced toward the windows where the late afternoon light was already turning golden and soft. The drive back to Ohio is long, and it's growing late. You're welcome to stay the night here if you'd like. There's a guest room ready. Frank looked out at the deepening sky, felt the familiar weight of fatigue settling into his bones, and, for once, did not argue. Thank you. I'll accept. That night, in the simple guest room with its faded floral wallpaper and single window overlooking the overgrown garden, Frank lay down expecting the usual pattern. Restless hours, the cough rising in the darkness, waking suddenly at 3 or 4 in the morning gasping for air, staring at the ceiling until dawn. Instead, something different happened that he slept, deeply, without interruption, without the familiar tightness in his chest pulling him awake. When morning light finally slipped through the curtains, accompanied by the soft chorus of birds in the bare trees outside, Frank opened his eyes and lay still for a long moment, trying to understand the sensation. He felt rested, truly rested. The last time he had awakened like this was perhaps years earlier, before the illness had taken root. He sat up slowly, drew a cautious breath, and found it came more easily than he remembered. Must be the country air, he murmured, grasping for the rational explanation. Far from city pollution, good for the lungs. He clung to the thought as he dressed and packed. Frank secured the statue with meticulous care. Layers of protective foam, a custom-reinforced wooden crate, every precaution he always took with irreplaceable objects, and began the long drive back to Ohio. Once in his laboratory, a familiar, slightly cluttered space at the rear of his office filled with metal shelves of labeled boxes, high-resolution scanners, magnifying lamps, and the quiet hum of computers, the statue was placed on the central work table beneath a bright, articulated light. This was the place where Frank felt most at home, surrounded by the tools of his trade that on the first day back, he noticed the cough was lighter. Not gone, still present, but less frequent, less forceful. He dismissed it immediately. Perhaps the night of unbroken rest had helped. Perhaps it was nothing more than a temporary fluctuation. On the second day, he climbed the narrow staircase to the upper office level without pausing halfway to catch his breath. For 3 years, there had not been a single day without at least one such episode, often several. That morning, nothing. No hand pressed to the wall. No labored waiting. Just ordinary movement. Frank sat down in his chair, looked across the room at the statue of the Virgin Mary bathed in soft window light, and said quietly, almost accusingly, "Coincidence. Just a coincidence." On the third day, he woke feeling something he had almost forgotten existed: energy. Not dramatic or youthful, but a gentle lifting of the constant heaviness that had pressed on him for so long. Breathing felt easier, lighter. He knew how strange this was for someone who, only weeks earlier, had measured every step, rationed every effort. His assistants noticed. David, who had worked with Frank for 5 years, and Michelle, the restoration specialist who had joined more recently, had grown accustomed to the rhythm of their employer's illness. The pauses, the pallor, the careful way he moved. That week, they exchanged glances more than once. "Boss, are you feeling all right?" David asked one afternoon, watching Frank move briskly between workstations. "I'm fine," Frank replied. And for the first time in years, the words felt true. Later, when Frank had stepped out for a moment, Michelle turned to David in the storage room. "Did you see him climb the stairs today? No stopping, no catching his breath. When was the last time you saw that?" David shook his head slowly. "A very long time ago. Maybe never since I started here." "What do you think happened?" Michelle asked, glancing toward the laboratory door. "I don't know," David answered. "But something changed after that trip to the countryside. And if it's connected to that statue, well, I'm not going to complain. It's good to see him like this again." Frank, meanwhile, continued his research. He examined the statue under ultraviolet light, took precise measurements, photographed every detail, and sent images to trusted colleagues. An art historian in Florence who specialized in 18th century Marian devotional sculpture, another in Madrid familiar with Spanish religious woodcarving traditions. The consensus came quickly and unanimously. The piece was genuine, approximately 250 years old, most likely originating from a workshop in northern Italy or southern Spain, where the delicate, almost luminous carving of Marian figures had flourished during that period. The estimated value, while still being refined, was already significant, enough to be considered a major discovery in the field of sacred art. Yet none of these findings occupied Frank's thoughts as fully as they once would have. Beneath the professional satisfaction, something else was stirring, a quiet, persistent urgency he could not explain. An inner insistence that he needed to reach out to Brian, his estranged son. There was no logical reason for it, no recent event, no new trigger, but the feeling remained, steady and growing, like a melody that refused to leave the mind. That night, Frank sat alone in the laboratory, the statue resting on its stand, the small desk lamp casting gentle shadows across her serene face. He stared at her for a long time, unsettled by the emotion he could not name. Frank sat alone in the dim light of his laboratory long after David and Michelle had left for the evening. The statue of the Virgin Mary remained on the work table, her carved face serene and unchanging under the soft glow of the desk lamp. He looked at her for what felt like hours, the persistent inner urging refusing to fade. There was no rational explanation for it. No recent message from Brian, no anniversary or family date to remind him. Yet the need to reach out grew stronger with every passing minute, like a quiet voice that would not be silenced. That night, after turning off the lights and locking the office, Frank drove home through the empty streets. In the stillness of his apartment, he picked up his phone and opened the contact list. Brian's name stared back at him. The last call between them had been brief, strained, filled with awkward pauses. A conversation that ended too quickly and left too much unsaid. Frank's thumb hovered over the call button. He almost set the phone down again. What would he even say? Where would he begin after so much silence? He took a slow, deep breath, easier now than it had been in years, and pressed the button. The phone rang 3 times. Frank's heart beat harder with each one. "Hello." Brian's voice came through, cautious, surprised. "Brian, it's your dad." A long pause. "Dad, is everything okay? Did something happen?" Frank closed his eyes. "No, nothing happened. I wanted to talk to you." Another silence, heavier this time. "Talk about what?" "I don't know," Frank admitted, his voice quieter than usual. "Everything. Nothing. I messed up, Brian. I messed up badly. I know there's no excuse for the way I pushed you away, for always putting work first, for letting years go by without being the father you deserved. I know it's late, and I know I don't have the right to ask for anything. But if you'll let me, I want to try, even if it's just a little. I want to try to be there now." The line was quiet for so long that Frank wondered if Brian had hung up. Then, softly, his son spoke. "Why now?" Frank swallowed. "Because something woke me up. I don't know how to explain it. I just realized I was losing the only thing that really matters. And I can't pretend anymore that it doesn't." Brian let out a slow breath. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay, we can talk. I don't know if I can forgive everything right away. I don't know if it'll work. But we can try." "Thank you," Frank whispered, the knot in his throat tightening. "Thank you for even answering." "Don't thank me yet, Dad. We've got a long road." "I know, but we can walk it together." The days that followed were tentative, fragile. Short phone calls that lasted only a few minutes at first. Text messages about ordinary things, the weather, a new project at Brian's job, a movie they had both happened to watch. The silences between words were still there, but they felt less like walls and more like pauses, spaces where something new might grow. Then came the Sunday when Brian drove to visit. Frank had been restless all morning. He cleaned the apartment 3 times, straightened books that were already straight, checked the time every few minutes. When the doorbell finally rang, he opened the door and found his son standing there, looking older than Frank remembered, yet somehow still the boy he had once carried on his shoulders. For a moment, neither of them moved. They stood awkwardly, unsure whether to shake hands, wave, or simply stand in silence. Then Frank stepped forward and pulled Brian into a hug, an embrace that felt clumsy after so many years, but real. Brian stiffened briefly, then slowly returned it. "Hi, Dad." "Hi, son." They went to lunch at the small Italian restaurant a few blocks away. The conversation began with safe topics: Brian's work in software development, the changing seasons, a shared memory of a childhood trip to the lake. Little by little, the silences grew softer. The words came more naturally. Toward the end of the meal, Brian looked across the table at his father. "You seem different," he said quietly. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Different how?" "I don't know. More present, I guess. Lighter, like you're actually here." Frank smiled, a real, gentle smile that reached his eyes. "I am better," he said. "More than I can explain." Brian studied him for a long moment. There was something in his gaze, not full forgiveness yet, but the beginning of hope. "That's good, Dad," he said. "That's really good." Before leaving, Brian paused at the door. "Thank you for calling," he said. "Thank you for trying." Frank felt the familiar tightness in his throat, but this time it was different, not from illness, but from gratitude. "Thank you for answering," he replied. A few days later, the test results arrived. Frank sat once again in the same chair in the doctor's office where, 3 years earlier, he had first heard the word degenerative. The doctor flipped through the new reports, frowning, then looked up with genuine confusion. "This is unusual," he said slowly. Frank's pulse quickened. "Unusual how?" "Your lungs," the doctor continued, shaking his head. "They're significantly better. The function has improved by almost 60% compared to your last scans. Based on the progression we saw before, this shouldn't be possible." Frank remained silent, letting the words settle. "I wouldn't say you're cured," the doctor added carefully, "but you're much better. In 30 years of practice, I've never seen a degenerative condition reverse like this. Sometimes the body does things medicine can't explain." Frank nodded slowly. "Sometimes," he repeated, but in his heart, he knew it was not sometimes. He knew it had begun in that quiet upstairs room, with the scent of roses that should not have been there, with the statue that had waited 2.5 centuries for someone who needed to be reminded that life could still change. He left the office and walked through the city without a destination, past parks he had never stopped in, along sidewalks full of people who had no idea what was happening inside him. The sun was setting, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. And as he walked, Frank thought about everything he had lost by chasing things that, in the end, mattered so little. The marriage he had allowed to fade, the son he had pushed away, the friends and family he had quietly let drift out of his life. For the first time in decades, he admitted the truth aloud, even if only to himself. "I don't know what's happening," he said softly, sitting on a wooden bench in a small square as the city lights began to come on one by one. "I don't know why I'm getting better. I don't know why I can't stop thinking about my son. I don't know anything anymore." And strangely, that admission did not frighten him. For once, it felt like freedom. Frank returned the statue to the Price family a few weeks later. He drove back to the countryside on a crisp November morning, the reinforced crate secured carefully in the back seat. Catherine welcomed him at the door with the same quiet warmth she had shown on his first visit. When he presented the complete authentication report, pages filled with photographs, measurements, comparative analyses, and the unanimous conclusions of specialists from Florence and Madrid. Her eyes widened slightly. "It's confirmed, then," she said softly, tracing a finger along the cover page. 250 years old. Northern Italian school, most likely. And the value? Substantial, Frank finished for her. Enough that I would recommend a reputable auction house with experience in sacred art, or perhaps a private sale to a museum or collector who understands its devotional significance. This isn't just an antique. It's a piece of living history, one that has been prayed before for generations. Catherine nodded, tears glistening but not falling. "My grandmother always said it brought peace to the house. I think she would be happy to know it was treated with such care." Before he left, Frank asked if he might have a moment alone with the statue one last time. Catherine understood without needing explanation. She stepped aside, and he carried the crate into the same small upstairs room where everything had begun. He opened it slowly. There she was again, the Virgin Mary, hands joined, cloak falling in those impossibly graceful folds, face serene and gentle as ever. Frank stood before her for a long time, saying nothing. No words felt adequate. Instead, he simply breathed, deeply, freely, and felt the quiet gratitude rise in his chest like a tide that had been waiting years to come in. When he finally closed the crate and carried it downstairs, he thanked Catherine once more and drove away under a pale winter sky. Back in Ohio, life continued, but it was no longer the same life. Frank worked long hours without the familiar drag of exhaustion. He completed evaluations that once would have left him breathless by midday. He climbed stairs without thinking about them. The cough, once a constant companion, had become a rare visitor, then a memory. He no longer measured every breath. He simply lived in the corner of his office. Near the window where morning light fell most gently, he placed a small image of the Virgin Mary. Nothing grand, just a simple plaster statue, purchased quietly from a religious goods shop downtown. No one commented on it. He never explained it. But every morning when he arrived, and every evening before he left, his eyes would rest on her for a moment. Not in formal prayer. He still did not know how to pray, but in acknowledgement. A silent thank you for the scent of roses that had bloomed where none should have grown, for the breath that had returned when doctors said it could not, for the son who now answered his calls that he had read, in the course of his research, about the ancient title given to Mary in Catholic tradition, mystical rose. The flower without thorns, the symbol of perfect love that appears again and again in stories of her presence. Scents of roses reported at apparition sites, in rooms where healings occurred, in moments when heaven seemed to bend very close to earth. He did not know whether to call what had happened to him a miracle. He still hesitated over the word. But he could not deny the fragrance that had filled that empty room, nor the way his body had begun to mend, nor the bridge that was slowly being rebuilt between him and Brian. Was Frank Wise still an atheist? He no longer felt the need to answer the question with certainty. He was no longer angry at the idea of something greater than himself. He was no longer compelled to prove that everything could be explained, measured, controlled. Some things he had come to accept simply happen, quietly, tenderly, without fanfare, and their happening is enough. One evening, after finishing a routine examination of a 19th century bronze clock, Frank stood, stretched, and drew a long, effortless breath. Such a simple act, one most people never notice. For him, it remained astonishing. He glanced at the small statue on the shelf, then reached for his phone. "Hey, Brian," he said when his son answered. "Are you free for dinner tomorrow?" "I am, Dad. That Italian place?" "That's the one." Frank smiled into the quiet office. "See you there." He hung up, set the phone down, and looked once more at the gentle face of Mary. His life had changed. He did not fully understand how. He did not need to. The change itself was enough. And so, the impossible quietly became part of Frank Wise's ordinary days, that he no longer hurried through life measuring every breath. no longer braced himself against walls when climbing stairs, no longer woke in the small hours gasping for air that seemed determined to stay just out of reach. Instead, he moved through his work with a calm steadiness he had forgotten was possible. He finished reports without fatigue clouding his thoughts. He met with clients without needing to pause mid-sentence. He lived, not as a young man suddenly restored, but as someone who had been given back the simple gift of presence. And every time he looked toward the small statue of the Virgin Mary on the shelf near his office window, something soft opened inside him. He did not kneel. He did not speak formal prayers. Yet the gratitude was real, steady, unspoken. He remembered the fragrance of roses that had filled an empty room where no flowers grew. He remembered the medical charts that defied every expectation. Most of all, he remembered the voice of his son answering the phone after so many months of silence, and the awkward, precious hug that followed weeks later. In the long hours of research that followed his first encounter, Frank had come across the ancient title given to Mary in the Church's tradition, Rosa Mystica, the mystical rose. A flower without thorns, a symbol of perfect, pure love. Throughout centuries, countless witnesses, simple people, children, the suffering, the doubting, had described the same inexplicable sign, the sudden, overwhelming scent of roses in places where no rose could be. At Lourdes, at Fatima, in quiet bedrooms where healings arrived without explanation. In rooms like the one on the second floor of an old countryside house where a weary man had stood alone with a wooden statue 250 years old, Frank did not know whether to call what happened to him a miracle in the strict sense of the word. He still hesitated over such language. Old habits die slowly. But he could no longer pretend the fragrance had been imagination. He could no longer deny that his lungs, once steadily failing, had begun to heal in ways medicine called impossible. And he could no longer ignore the gentle, persistent pull that had drawn him back to his son, back to the life he had almost lost entirely while chasing things that, in the end, could not love him back. Something simply happened, quietly, tenderly, without demanding proof. And their happening is enough. Frank and Brian continued to meet, sometimes for dinner at the same Italian restaurant, sometimes for a walk in the park Frank had never visited before. The conversations grew longer, deeper. The silences became comfortable instead of heavy. Forgiveness did not arrive all at once, like a sudden sunrise. It came gradually, like dawn spreading slowly across a winter sky. But it came one late afternoon. After finishing a routine evaluation of a small bronze reliquary from the 19th century, Frank stood, stretched his back, and drew a long, full breath, something he still marveled at every single day. He glanced at the little statue on the shelf, then picked up his phone. "Hey, Brian," he said when the call connected. "Are you free this weekend? I was thinking maybe we could drive out to the lake, the one we used to go to when you were small, just for the day." There was a brief pause, then Brian's voice, warm and a little surprised. "Yeah, Dad, I'd like that." Frank smiled into the quiet office. "Good. I'll pick you up Saturday morning." He set the phone down, looked once more at the gentle face of Mary, and felt the same quiet gratitude rise again, steady and sure. His life had changed. Not with thunder and lightning, not with dramatic visions or voices from heaven, but with a fragrance that should not have existed, with a healing that should not have happened, with a reconciliation that had once seemed too late. And that gentle, unexpected change was enough. Before we finish, I want to invite you to become part of our prayer community dedicated to the Virgin Mary, a place where people from every corner of the world gather to pray together, to share the graces they have received, and to support one another in faith and hope. If something in Frank's story stirred your heart, if you feel even the smallest desire to join this chain of prayer, click below and become a member of the channel today. Come pray with us. You are not alone. And if you have stayed with us until the very end of this story, please do one small thing for me. Write in the comments, "Roses, the scent that should not have existed, but that changed everything. I read every one. Every time I see those words, I know one more heart has been touched by the tender love of Our Lady. Share a miracle you have witnessed or experienced in your own life. Pass this story along to someone who needs a little hope renewed today. May the Virgin Mary, mystical Rose, continue to wrap you and your family in her mantle of grace, peace, and protection. Amen.